Not at this time of the morning. So, good morning, everybody. And to those who enjoyed a little bit too much hospitality in Stockholm yesterday, good morning. Thank you. So, sometime back in 2021, I think it was, a few years ago, I saw a tweet come across my timeline back when Twitter wasn't owned by one person. And it was talking about building your brand. That if you blog and you're using someone else's network in order to blog, then no matter how awesome that network is, you're using your energy and your skills to build their platform rather than your own. I kind of thought, they've got a point. So this was like 10:30 at night. So I grabbed my laptop, I'm in bed, and I went out and I brought a domain. Got 3 domains because who can stop at one? So I got stacyclouds.net.com and .dev. And once I had those domains, I did absolutely nothing with them because I'm sure we all know that buying domains and using domains, they're kind of to take a domain and deploy WordPress and have a blog. I wanted to use it to play with new technology, to try new things, to experiment. And that meant that I needed to get a front end, something for the API, something to join them together, organize the domains, and lots of other stuff around that. And for a hobby, it was just too much, and I had too much on, and I just never got around to it. And then I started playing with Blazor, and I started playing with Azure Static Web Apps. Simplified, cheap way to get a dynamic application up into the cloud. See, when you deploy an Azure Static Web App, you get glue out of the box so that you've got your front end, you've got your API, and it just behaves as one application. You don't actually know that there's stuff there. It just works. Week, I think. If you have a repo, which right now only has a README, I need to add the git ignore. So you go off to another GitHub repo or whatever, you do all the searching to find out what to put in a git ignore for .NET. There's actually a wonderful trick for that. We can do .NET new git ignore, if I have spelt that right. And we now have a git ignore inside of our repo. I only learned that last week. I hope somebody else knows learned something today. Today is build a Blazor WebAssembly application, which is going to display a list of my blog posts. I blog on dev.to. So we're going to go to dev.to. We're going to get the list of posts on there because they have an awesome API. And then we're just going to get that on the site, kind of like just the first step to getting yourself online, get it deployed into production, and depending on how fast I talk and type, hopefully even add a custom domain to it. So we're going to start with the application first of all. And we are going to create a new application inside of Visual Studio. If the text is too small at the back, let me know and I will change it. It's a little bit small. Then let's see whether or not we can do something about that. Yeah, that is always a solution. Okay, let's try 150%, see what that one does for us. And now I've lost all of my applications. There we go. That a bit better? Awesome. So we're going to make a Blazor WebAssembly app. That's going to be the first one. We're going to call it live so that it goes into my repo. And my repo name is Blazor Talk Demo. So we're going to create this. We're going to do .NET 6 today. .NET 7 is awesome, but I'm just going to keep it simple for now. I'm going to change it next month. We're not going to add authentication today. We are obviously going to configure it for HTTPS. The most important one is we are not going to select the ASP.NET Core hosted because we want those static files that we can push up to the Azure Static Web App. So we'll create that and we see whether or not the computer is going to slow down because it's streaming or whether or not it's going to scaffold quickly. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. And then to this, we're going to add an API application or project. So that's going to be an Azure function. And that's going to be called API. Notice I called the client and the API. There's a good reason for that, which we'll get to in about 5-10 minutes or so. So scaffold that up, .NET 6, we're not going to create a function box. We're going to keep this one nice and empty. It's cleanup to do. And there we have the base of the application. Now, I do want to do a little bit of cleanup because there's some things that I just really hate in the default scaffolding. So I'm going to get rid of the sample data because I don't want that. And I'm going to clear up some pages. So we'll get rid of that awesome counter page. I'm sorry for those that like counting. And the fetch data. And we're going to clean up the index a little bit. So let's say cloud first. Hey, I spelled that right first time. Okay, I didn't spell that one right. I spoke too soon. There we go. That's like a little bit better. And as Terry Pratchett says, never trust anybody who uses more than 5 exclamation points. And then I just want to do a little bit of cleanup here because I want this space back, possibly depending on how much time we have. We've got rid of a couple of pages, so we're going to clean up the navigation links. And then we're going to delete the survey prompt because I don't want that. There we go. And in a couple of minutes, we've got kind of a clean solution that we can play with. This is actually how I started my my website. I use completely different CSS, but the actual structure is pretty much as it came out of the box from the Blazor app. So now we've done the cleanup, we're going to create some stuff. First up, we're going to make the Azure function that is going to get our data from dev.to. So let's close the tabs so we can clean that up a bit. And we need to make a model, and I'm going to cheat just a little bit. I'm going to use the same model to get the data from dev.to as to push it to the client. and probably should do, but again, you are going to dev.to side of your request. Otherwise, dev.to doesn't return any data. They introduced that halfway through last year, and I found out because somebody contacted me saying, "Do you know that your website doesn't work anymore?" And we're going to add a link to get to the blog post. And then we're going to do a build to make sure that I've not done anything wrong and push that up to GitHub. And then we can actually start to create the static web app itself. So add app, I'm on the right branch. Commit all and push, keep your fingers crossed for the Wi-Fi. That looks like it worked. So if I go into my GitHub now, yep, I have my API and my client, so now we can set this up. So in my Azure portal, let's get rid of these chancellors. I already have a resource group set up for my static web apps. You can see that I tested this yesterday just in case it goes horribly wrong and I need to show something that's, as we say in England, here's one I made earlier. But let's see if we can actually create a new one. So we're going to go into the marketplace and we are going to look for the static web app. And we're going to create that one. Now, subscription and resource group, I say this in all of my talks. This should be set up automatically for you because we did it from a resource group. But last year, I think it was, storage accounts had a bug in them in the portal and it never brought the resource group across. So always make sure that you've got the resource group you expect here and it's not just going to create you a random new resource group because of some weird stuff that's going on. Then we need to give it a name. Cloudburst demo. What I love about the names for static web apps, anybody who's used functions, storage accounts, or app services, you know that these have to be unique across the whole of Azure, and it leads to some really interesting naming conventions. For a static web app, this name does not influence the URL at all. So as long as it's unique inside of your resource group, you can call it what you want. Hopefully that leads to some slightly nicer naming conventions than I've had to use in the past. Come on, stay working, TV. Stay with me. Then we have our hosting plan. Now we have two options. We have the free tier, as it says, for hobbies, which is what we're going to be using today. And that actually does most of the stuff that you need for a general app. We also have the standard tier. That gives us access to more enterprisey authentication. It allows us more staging environments. It's just got a few extra options if you need it. It is hideously expensive if you go to the standard tier. It's like €7.50 a month. So be very careful when you click on that button. But like I say, for the most part, the free tier actually works. And then because I'm based in the Netherlands, I want to go to West Europe for my location. This doesn't affect the front end. Your front end is deployed globally anyway. It's only for your Azure functions run inside of this region. And if you create a staging environment, that is only in that environment too. So still make sure that you're as close to your users as possible. Can people keep their fingers crossed for this screen? Otherwise, you're going to have to look at this one in front of me, and that's tiny. Then we get our deployment details. Where are we going to deploy from? Now, when it first came out, you had one option here, GitHub, and that was it. Then they added the other. You've not got your fingers crossed, have you? Then they added the other, and you could set up your own deployment flow. And at last, they actually gave Azure DevOps some love, and it now integrates with that as well. If you use GitHub and Azure DevOps here, it will create you a CI/CD pipeline out of the box, which again, for a hobby site, when you're just quickly trying to set something up, is absolutely spectacular. We're going to be deploying from GitHub today. I'm already logged in. I need my Stacy Talks organization. We are deploying our Blazor Talk demo, and we're deploying the Cloudburst branch. Then we have our build presets. This is another feature which is just mind-blowing to me. Azure Static Web Apps knows what it needs to build. It looks at your code, figures out what languages you're using, what frameworks you're using, and just builds it for you. You don't need to tell it anything except for the location of the code. And it can do that for all of these frameworks. So Angular, Blazor, Next, Nuxt3, a new one. React, Svelte, Vue, and even static site generators. So you can pick from a whole range of things, and it just does it for you. If you need to, you can customize this. But again, for a hobby site, this is fine. The only thing we need to say is where the code is, and it defaults to client for the client and API to the API, which is why I use those in my code, because it just makes it easier. And the output location, if you're using Blazor, just leave this as is. You can ignore it. It will work, as long as you don't have a www root folder in your repo. If you're using Angular or React or something like that, you do need to put something in here, and you need to reference the documents to find out where that location is so that you can deploy your app. We're using Blazor, and that's simple. So we're just going to get this one set up. Do a quick create. And hopefully this is going to be slightly quicker than yesterday. Generally, this creates in like a few seconds. Yesterday, it took a couple of minutes. There we go. We have our resource available. And there is that URL that I was talking about. So we have a happy stone, which is great for Friday morning. We're happy. I've had yellow beaches and all sorts. It's awesome. If we click on this, then we have our application, and it's your Azure Static Web App is live and waiting for your content. The resource is created really quickly, but we've not put anything in there yet. If we come back to the portal, we can do this by going to the deployment history. And there we see that inside of my GitHub repo, we now have an action fired off or workflow fired off. That's going to take about 3 or 4 minutes to run, and I don't really want to fill dead air here and just talk randomly. So what we're going to do while this is deploying is have a look at running this locally, because there is kind of a hidden thing here of, I said at the start, there is glue when you deploy to Azure that connects your front end to your back end. You don't have that when you're running on your local machine. I don't have Azure on my little laptop. It's a good laptop. It's not that good. When this was in preview, you had to do all sorts of nasty things to get this working. So the application would actually know if it was running in development mode or in production, and it would set up cores for the Azure functions. It would set up different locations for your API. It worked, but it was extra stuff that you don't really want in your app. These days, it's a whole lot easier. So come on, Paul. I'm just pulling that Git workflow because otherwise the next time I make a change, I'm going to forget and it's going to say it can't push. So what we can do now is just simply set up the startup projects of our Visual Studio, and we want everything to start. And then we can fire up our application. And hopefully that's going to start running pretty quick. And of course, it's going to run on the wrong screen. So there's our functions. There is our application. Whoops. And going from a 4K screen to a full HD screen is interesting. And if we click on blog post, then we get an error. And it gets an error because it can't find that API because it's running on a different port. So what we need to do is copy this. We're going to go to a terminal, and we're going to use the Static Web App CLI in order to run this. Now, this was released in preview a couple of years ago. It's been in general availability since, I believe, May this year. You can do an awful lot with this Static Web App CLI, from deployment, logging into Azure, creating new static web apps. We're only going to use a functionality to run it locally for debug purposes today. So we're going to be using the start command. We're going to tell it where our application is running, HTTPS localhost 752. And then because Visual Studio changed recently for Azure Functions, I loved it when Azure Functions ran on 7071 all the time. Now they run on a random port, so we have to tell the static web app this. If your functions are running on 7071, this is all you need to get running because it just assumes that's where they are. But we need to, where are we? 7133. So we now need to tell it that the API location is did I say 7133? I did say 7133. And what this is going to do is spin up a Node.js server, which is going to pretend to be an Azure Static Web App on my machine. And come on, this is normally quicker than this. What have I done wrong? Done something wrong. I'm sure that that was API location. This is a problem with doing this at this time of the morning. API location. Did I do a typo in that? No. Seventy-one 33. Nope. Okay, This is a point when demos go wrong and it's really annoying. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to fix this the other way. I'm going to fix Visual Studio. I'm going to try and figure out what's wrong with that over this morning and I'll put it on Twitter later. For now, what we're going to do is come into properties, launch settings, and we're going to get rid of these command line args just so that it runs in the right place. So now we can do a different one. Now we don't actually need to tell it where the API is running. Thank you. And now we get this new URL, localhost 4280. If we go into Chrome now and we load this, you can see in the background, it's getting all of my files. Now, what this Node.js server does is basically a little bit of proxying. Any request that comes into the front end, it is going to send forward to the Blazor application. Anything that comes to that glue is going to instead go to different locations. So it's going to push the API request to our functions, and then it's going to crash on us. Oh, this is not going well, is it? What are you doing? That's fun. Disable cache. Let's try that again. I've only ever had this happen to me once, and that happened in .NET 7. Thank you. So now we have our app loading, now that we've kicked the cache and swore a little bit. Now when we go to blog post, we still get it. Wow, this is fun. What's the problem this time? At gateway, really? Okay, I think I'm possibly gonna have to cancel the local demos because apparently my machine is not happy this morning. I ran through this yesterday. Everything works. Of course, it dies when you're giving a. Oh, it's still running on 7133. That's interesting. I changed that. Is that saved? That's better. Okay, now it's on 7071. So now if we go to local 4280, third time looking. I don't know if I'm on the third time or more, but. And now we have our blog post. Yay! So now we can click on this eventually, and this opens in a new screen. Now, I was going to show you a little bit of debugging, but I think I'm going to skip that since that took more time than I want. There's one important thing for debugging that you need to know. It's a Blazor issue, not a static web app issue. If you are trying to debug your Blazor WebAssembly application, you need to run it in this browser that opens when you start your Visual Studio project. Because if you open it in a different browser, it doesn't have the tunneling back to Visual Studio, and all your breakpoints will be ignored. Now, after all that time, I can't imagine that this hasn't actually deployed to production. There we go. And if we refresh the page now, we have inside of 30 minutes, we are available on production. We can get our blog posts, and we can open them in new windows. At least it worked on production. It's kind of the opposite. It didn't work on my machine. It did just work in production. So that's how we can get up and running. The next bit that I want to talk about is the next steps. So say that you grow your application, so you want it to do more fun things. For me, myself, I want to actually write my blog post on my website. That is my next step that I said at the start of this year, I'm going to do it this year. Now I'm going to say I'm going to do it next year. But my next step is actually want to actually code this on my own machine. That means I need to start doing some authentication because don't take this the wrong way, but I don't want you putting words into my mouth on my website, so I need to know who's doing it. I am not an authentication person. That is absolutely not my speciality. We've got someone in the office for that, and he's amazing. Thankfully, though, you get this out of the box with Azure Static Web Apps, and it kind of just works. So if we go to this .auth endpoint, this is another one of those glue endpoints, and we go to the me, then we get this client principal. It's null because I'm not logged in. So let's change that. If we go to login/Twitter, and I've spelled it correctly, we go off to Twitter, it authenticates me. I grant consent because I've never used a static web app before. And I'm now logged in. Now, there's no code to show any of my login on the screen, of course, but we can go back to that endpoint, so .auth/me, and now we have a client principal available. And I will zoom that one in so that you can see it at the back. Is that okay for you there, Mike? So the client principal, when you go to the me endpoint, obviously we send all of the security headers that we need for the static web app itself, and we get this data back. Starts off with the identity provider. I logged in with Twitter, so we get back Twitter. You can also use Azure Active Directory, in which case you get AAD. You can use GitHub, and you can use Google, which officially is in preview, but it's been in preview for that long. I'm assuming that you can possibly use it, but don't trust me overly with that. Mike's nodding his head, and he's from Microsoft, so you can use Google. There's also a Facebook, which is in preview, but I think you have to be part of a private preview for that because that never works for me. That always gives me errors. Contact your administrator and get special rights. It's like, okay, we'll ignore that one. Then we get a user ID. Now, this is unique to my Twitter user in this static web app. So if you go to a second static web app and log in with the same user, you are not going to have the same user ID. So you can't use it to correlate between different apps. Also means I'm not doing any kind of doxing here because this user ID is pointless outside of this demo application. Then we have our user details. This changes depending on the provider that you're using. So I logged in with Twitter, so I get my Twitter handle, Stacy_Cash. If I'd logged in with GitHub, I would get Stacy Cash, which is my GitHub handle. If I log in with Active Directory or I log in with Google, I get my email address instead. So be aware what you're going to get back from this if you plan on using it inside of your application for anything. Finally, we get user roles. 2 out of the box, every single person gets this. We get anonymous and we get authenticated. I honestly don't know why anonymous is in there because why do I need to know if somebody's anonymous? That's just my general assumption anyway. So what we're going to do now is add this to our app. We're going to look at how to use this inside of our Blazor application, and we're going to look how to use this inside of the API. And I'm going to reset this, otherwise the site isn't going to be readable the next time we go there. So first thing that we're going to do is add this to the client application. And again, full disclosure, I would not do this way in production, but I want to show you the mechanics and I want to get through it in the next 24 minutes before I run out of time because I don't want to do a mic. You're welcome. Friends like this, eh? So the first thing that we need to do is add a Nugget package. And that is the ASP.NET Core Components Authorization, the one that we always use inside of an ASP application. So install that and ignore all of these screens and just click accept because nobody ever reads them. And then we need to add a state provider. So I'm just going to add this to the root of my application because I'm going to be naughty. Static Web App Authentication State Provider, because we need the state provider inside of the Blazor app to know if we're logged in. Now, there's a little bit of code here. I'm going to go through it all with you. We're going to start with this authentication data class at the beginning. That is just the wrapper that we saw for that client principal on the .me endpoint. Then we have the client principal itself, where we get the identity provider, user ID, the user details, the roles, and then we get 2 new ones. We're not going to be using these today, but it's good to know they exist. If you're on the free tier, you don't see these ever. But if you're on the standard tier and you're using custom authentication, then you get the access token and the claims from the custom authentication provider. Gives you more control over what your user can do inside of your application. And the SWA claims is just basically a key value pair with type and value that you can use inside your app. Now we're going to use this inside of an authentication state provider, and we're going to do three things. We are going to get that client principal that I just showed on the screen. We are going to then turn those client principal into a claims principal, because that's what we need inside of our app. And finally, we're going to return a new authentication state that we can use inside of the application. Getting the client principal, we quite literally go to that auth.me endpoint because we're running a Blazor WebAssembly. It's in the browser. When we make the request to that endpoint, all the security headers go with it so we can trust the data that comes back. We can use that to validate our user. We're going to deserialize that into a client principal, and if we don't get one, we're just going to return an empty object and assume the person isn't logged in. Once we have that client principal, to convert it into the claims principal, I got this code from, I believe, Anthony Chu like 18 months ago. It still works, so I'm not changing it. First thing that we do is remove the anonymous role from our claims, our roles. Then we check, do we have any roles left? Now we should do, because I said every user gets both anonymous and authenticated. So if somebody's logged in, there should be one role left. If there's not, we just return an empty claims principal and that person's not authenticated inside of our app. If they do have roles left, then we create a new claims identity. We pass in the name identifier and name, and then just all of the roles that we got back from that auth.me endpoint. And then we return that authentication state. And actually, from this point on, you just use it like any other authentication inside of a Blazor application. So let's do that next. We need to add this to our program CS because we need to add it to our services. So we're going to add the authorization call that comes from the components authorization namespace. And then for the state provider, we're going to use that new class that we just created. A couple of last things that we need to do before we can really use it inside of our app. One is we need to make the authorization namespace available to all of our components. And we're going to do this by using this _imports razor file. This is possibly one of my favorite things in Blazor. Before we got global usings inside of C#, we had global usings inside of Blazor by putting it into this file, and it just magically appears everywhere now. And last but not least, we need to add a cascading authentication state to each of our components. And we do that by wrapping our router in this cascading authentication state component. And then we need to clean this up because I hate having badly indented code. And literally now, we just use it like any other authentication inside our Blazor. So the first one that we're going to do is add a login button for our user. So we're going to do that inside of that nav menu class. And we're going to use this authorized view. And then we have two options. We have authorized or not authorized. Now, this is very binary, but you can limit this to different roles, so you can really pinpoint just the authorization that you need at this point. And what we're going to do is say, if you're not authorized, then you can just log in via Twitter. If you are authorized, then we're going to change that button to link to the logout location. And just for fun, we're going to say that if you're a super user, then we're going to tell you you're a super user. And otherwise, we're just going to say you're a standard user. Last but not least, I want to add something to my main layout just to say what type of authentication provider we're using. So when we log in with Twitter, it's going to say Twitter. When we log in with GitHub, it's going to say GitHub. Just again, to show you how to get access information out of that context to put it on the screen. Now we're going to start the API security because this is all that we need to do for the front end. Weird thing is, the first file that we need to change for API security is inside of our client application. And that is because inside of this www root folder, we're going to add a static web app config file, a programmatical way to control your application. So we want a new file, it's going to be JSON. Now, this file can do a whole lot more than we are going to be using today. But at the very least, you can match routes, you can add authentication to routes, you can change the status code for routes, and you can add a navigation fallback, which is something that's quite important when you're using a single page application. So let's look at the API stuff first. We're going to create a couple of functions. We're going to have auth test, and because naming's hard, we're going to have auth test 2. One of them is going to be limited to those super users, and the other one is going to be open to anybody who is authenticated. We also have this status code 404 on the AAD login. I want to put this in here because I said at the start, or I showed you on the application, we have authentication built in. I've not done anything. It's just there. I can't turn it off. Now, there may be applications that you just don't want people to authenticate at all. There may be applications where you are really linked into something like Twitter, so you only want people to log in using that Twitter social login. Because you can't turn it off, the only thing you can do is override that endpoint with a status code so that it just reads as doesn't exist. If you want to turn off authentication altogether, you just do auth star. So something like that. And then no authentication will work inside of your application. It's effectively turned off. Now I've got to try and delete this and make sure I don't delete too much. The last one that I've got inside of this static web app config JSON, it's not to do with the authentication that we're looking at, but it's also super important. If I go back to my application and I go to my blog post page and I hit F5, I get a 404 not found error because this is a single page application and that blog post route only exists inside the browser. If you try and go to the server, it's looking at static files. It doesn't exist. You get a 404 error. If we add this navigation fallback here, then what we say is for anything that isn't an image or a CSS, and I always forget to put in my notes, I actually like to add my API here as well, because I don't particularly want my APIs returning my site. So if we're not in any of these routes, then what we're going to do is get the contents of index.html and return it instead of whatever you think you're going to be getting at that endpoint. That's going to load the Blazor application. You're still going to be on the right URL, so the Blazor routing is going to kick in, and your application will exist where it needs to. When you're running this locally, that never happens because there's always some kind of development server running. So you think everything's fantastic. You can hit 5, you can deep link, and then you go to production and you swear and pull your hair out just a little bit. So don't do that. Add these 4 lines. Now for the actual API itself. Where am I for the API? We need to add, let's do a bit of cleanup so that you can see what's going on. Close all tabs. We're going to add another new class to handle our security, but it's going to work in an ever so slightly different way. So our static web app API authentication. In the front end, we go to that auth.me endpoint because we have all of our security headers. It can get the data that we need and everything works. The backend, that doesn't happen because we don't have that security header. If you go to auth.me, then you're going to go there as an unauthenticated user. You're going to get a null object back. Thankfully, because the API sits behind that glue and it has to go through the static web app to get there, it knows that you're logged in and it injects this XMS client principal header into the request. So you don't need to do anything to get access to authentication in the backend, aside from read this header in the request. You can't send this from the front end. The static web app itself makes sure that this is correct for you. So again, it's trustworthy data that you can use to authenticate your users. If we don't have it, return a new client principal, of course. Otherwise, we just decode it from base 64 and deserialize it into a client principal, and we have our client principal available to use inside of our Azure functions, which is what we're going to do now. I think I've just about got enough time after all the fun getting it to work locally, first of all. We're going to add an auth test. Now, this is going to be a really stupid little Azure function that all it does is get access to our client principal, read some information out from it, and then just send this information back as text to the front end just to show you that something's happening. And I want this twice because I want my auth test and I want that auth test too. So we're going to copy this and paste it. Let's rename that to auth test 2. Just do a few changes here to make sure that I'm seeing the right data. And one more. And that is everything that we need to do to get this working. We don't actually do any checks for the user's authorization on the backend itself. That's all taken care of by that static web app JSON file, that configuration, and it's done for us, which again, I love because code that I don't have to write is code that I can't put bugs into. Professional bug maker. So let's add auth and push that up. Yeah, that's pushed. Let's check it's rebuilding. Yeah, okay, that's rebuilding. Now, before I run this locally, I need to take a slight jump because my next demo takes about 10 minutes to set up. So I need to give Azure time to do its thing. We have this wonderful Happy Stone URL that we're using. That is not my brand. It's, okay, Happy Stone's easy enough to remember, but not 063860803.2. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue and it's not going to go on a sticker somewhere to put on your laptop. So we can add a custom domain. This you can do out of the box reasonably simply using this customs domain endpoint. I am in a different Azure Static Web App because you need to set up your DNS to do this. I'm not going to go through those steps because it depends on who your DNS provider is to how it's set up. But we're going to add an extra custom domain to this. And we're going to add, which one are we adding? I always forget this part. I didn't write it down, did I? That was stupid. Oh, yes, I did. Here we go. So we're going to add book club because this is my book club application. .stacyclouds.dev. We're going to have to create a CNAME record using this value inside of our DNS. And I did that previously, and fingers crossed it's still going to work. That is not a good sign. So we're going to add this, and like I say, this can either take about a minute or it can take 3 hours. So I'm hoping that it's going to be kind of on the earlier side of that so that in 10 minutes, we can see this working. While that's going, now we can get back to our authentication and we're going to see how to debug this locally. Because again, we don't have that endpoint. So how do we do this inside of our static web app CLI? We'll start our application again. And I also need to restart my static web app CLI. Now, I'm only restarting this because of that static web app config JSON file. Generally, if you're not changing that file, you start this up when you start developing, you do all of your changes, and you just leave this running until you need to shut down your machine. But that static web app config file is only read once when it starts up, so I made a change to that. I need to restart it. So we'll start that up. Hopefully this is going to work properly. There's an important warning here, which I forgot to mention. This emulator may not match the cloud environment exactly. Always deploy and test your app in Azure. Do that because there are a few very subtle differences which can kind of bite you later on. So let's go back to our app, and again we want to go to localhost 4280, and I want to go to that API auth test. This is one of the differences between production and not production. When I'm running this in the node server locally, the URL is case sensitive. When I'm running it in Azure, the URL is not case sensitive. It took me about an hour to figure out why this wasn't working locally the first time that happened to me. But if I go to here, we get a 401 unauthorized, kind of what we expect because we're not logged in. And if we go to auth test 2, we kind of get the same one. So far, so good. So now we want to go back to that login Twitter endpoint, and we get this wonderful new screen. And we get this screen because the Azure Static Web Apps, they are set up to work with these social providers. They have all of the keys and everything else, and it's done for you and you don't have to think about it. My machine cannot use those same endpoints to authenticate somebody. But because it is abstracted out to that client principal, what we can do is just pretend that we've logged in and just return the information that we need into our app. So I am going to be done it again. Cloudbert user. I'm going to blame Mike again because, or Magnus, one of the two, because one of you had the Muppets on your phone earlier, which is, Sesame Street. So you've got, Bert and Ernie. So, yeah. So we can log in here, and I'm not going to wait for that one to go through because that takes too long and we don't overly care too much. If I go to this API auth test 2 now, we get the data back out of our application. So we can just see that we can access it. If we go to auth test, wow, we get a real bad thing. That was awesome. Okay, that's a new one for me. Shall we fire that one up again? Try. I kind of blame myself here just a little bit. Just before I came here, I generally travel with 2 laptops in case one dies on me and I need to go to a backup. And I decided this time I'm going to save my back. I'm only going to bring 1 laptop. And I tweeted, I was worried what happens if it goes wrong. That was stupid. I was asking for this. So I want to go to 4280 again, and let's try and go to auth test. Are we still logged in, or did that really die on us? You know what? We're running out of time, so you get the idea. That works. So let's now log in with the right credentials and hope that this works. Log in Twitter. Inside of here, we can just add that super user role. This one I really love because when you're working on this locally, you don't have to have an account set up for each of your providers. You don't have to have an account set up with each of the different rights and combination of rights that you need. You can just set it up, run with it, and it's really easy to debug this way. And if you're in a team, you can even share IDs. You're no longer having to share usernames and passwords of test users. It opens up a whole new way of testing your app when running locally. Does also open up a whole new layer of security issues. Do not connect this to your production environment because you can cheat with all of your security, and that's not good. With great power comes great responsibility and all that. So now when we log in, hopefully now it's not going to give us a 500 error. If we go to auth test 2, we should still get data. If we go to auth test, it still dies on us. Trust me, this works. Honest. So that's how we can work on this locally. How we're doing for time. We've got 5 minutes left. Let's see whether or not our deploy is finished. Our deploy is finished. So now, first up, let's refresh the page and see our blog post so that we know that our navigation fallback's working. Make our users happier. We're a standard user because I'm logged in using Twitter and it's already got that authentication information available. And that means that if I go to API/auth test, we get a 403, which isn't what you should have seen when running locally. When running locally, this is a 401 as well, which is incorrect. Like I say, what you see on your machine is almost, but not exactly the same as what you get in production. So be aware that these differences exist. But we should be able to go to auth test 2, and that works. Now we're going to add that user. So how do we get those roles, which are really easy on the back end, in the front end or in production? We go to the role management tab, And here we can invite users. You can invite 25 users using this screen in the standard tier. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's only the users that need special rights that you need to add in this screen. If you need more than 25 users, you can use the standard tier that you pay for. And then using this screen, you can add 25 users, which sounds kind of the same, and I honestly don't know why it's not more. But more than that, if you're using the custom authentication provider, you can provide your own special Azure function to handle your roles. And then you basically don't have a limit on how many users you can add to your app because you control everything yourself. We're just using the standard tier though, and I'm going to add my GitHub user. So I want Stacy Cash, and I want to give Stacy Cash super user rights and not a black screen. We generate a link. Now we can come back to my app. We can log out. And this link is then going to say, go to GitHub, log me in, check that I consent to what I need. Keep our fingers crossed that everything's working. And you can see that I'm a super user now. So now when we come back to that auth test 2, we get data. Auth test 1, we still get data. So we now have that role-based access for our API set up. And we can start to use our application with a little bit more security on top of it. 2 minutes left. Did the custom domain work? It worked. Cool. So now this URL should go to a very poor Angular application, complete with a valid certificate so that you get your SSL out of the box. And that is how we can add the custom domains to the application. Aside from setting up the DNS, which is always fun, actually doing it inside of the portal is quite easy. And you can do all of this stuff on the command line as well. I'm nearly done. Be nice. So let's go back to our presentation. So we have had, what, 50 minutes of me hitting the keyboard and swearing at things going wrong. And in that time, we managed to do the whole, create the app, create the functions, push it up to GitHub, deploy the static web app, look at authentication, how we can get that working locally and in production, and we've added a custom domain. The site still looks awful, but at least it's there. So next steps, we can open up the CSS and make it look pretty. We can open up those blog posts locally instead of doing it on a different place. We can start to yell at the world who we are. On the screen right now, there's a QR code at the bottom that takes you to MS Learn so that you can learn more about Azure Static Web Apps. Awesome set of documentation that I hope everybody is using a lot because you can learn a lot using those resources. And pure self-promotion. In the last month, my book came out. Thank you. Which covers a lot of this. So if you want to learn more, you can also follow along the tutorials inside of the book. I've not got them on the desk, but if you like shiny things on your laptops, I have stickers with me, so come and grab me, and you're more than welcome to have some. I'm exactly on time, so I hope you have an awesome rest of the day. Thank you so much for your attention. Enjoy.